Okay, let's dive in. Youth sports, right? If you're involved, maybe as an athlete or a parent, a coach, you know that energy. It's fantastic. But, well, there are risks too. And concussions, they're a really big part of that conversation, unfortunately. Happening pretty often in young athletes. And the effects can be, well, worrying, both short term and maybe longer term too.
That's absolutely right. And, what makes it even more complicated is that even though people know concussions are a risk, they often just don't get reported. There's a whole bunch of reasons why a young athlete might keep quiet about it. And that's really what we're digging into today.
Exactly. So our goal here is to try and understand this whole issue a bit better. We're looking at some really solid research today, mainly this big new systematic review and meta-analysis that just came out. It pulled together, 22 different studies, all looking at communication and education stuff aimed at preventing sports concussions in teens and their parents or caregivers, too.
Yeah, 22 studies, so it gives us a pretty broad view.
So what does this big picture tell us? What actually works, what doesn't? And, what are the sticking points? Let's maybe start with the scale of the problem. Concussions, these mild traumatic brain injuries, technically, they really are common for kids and teens in sports.
Yeah, they are. The source really flags certain team sports, things like hockey, rugby, American football, basketball, soccer, wrestling.
Yeah.
These tend to have higher rates. And the stats, especially from the U.S., are quite something. Like around 20% of adolescent athletes, maybe 28% of college athletes, say they've had at least one concussion.
Wow.
Which is way higher than, say, the 10% you see in kids who aren't athletes.
And the immediate impact? It can be serious. We're talking potential changes in personality, mood swings, trouble concentrating or learning.
Definitely. And while, there's obviously a lot of concern about potential long-term things like neurodegenerative diseases, the source we looked at points out that the current research doesn't strongly support those long-term negative outcomes, especially for, amateur or youth athletes who've had concussions before.
Okay, so the jury might still be out on the very long term for most kids, but the short-term issues are definitely real.
Oh, absolutely. They can really disrupt a young person's life.
And a key thing the source keeps coming back to is this issue of underreporting. Why aren't these getting flagged?
Well, part of it is just the nature of a concussion, right?
Okay.
It's invisible. You can't see it like a broken arm.
Right.
Plus, there's often just a lack of really clear understanding about the symptoms, the risks, among everyone, athletes, coaches, even parents sometimes.
And then there's a whole culture around sports.
Exactly. That's huge. The review talks about athletes being reluctant because they're afraid of disappointing their team. That pressure.
That feeling of not wanting to let people down or being seen as, well, weak.
Yeah, precisely. Don't be a wimp, that kind of thing. It can genuinely make an athlete ignore symptoms, even if they know better. It's this mix of psychological stuff and social pressure that's a massive hurdle.
Okay, so that's the backdrop. Now, this big review we mentioned, how did they actually approach pulling all this research together?
So they took 22 studies published between 2014 and 2023, and they were very specific, only looking at communication and education programs in team sports. The focus was on adolescent athletes. They defined that quite broadly, like 10 to 24 years old, but often honing in on maybe 11 to 15 or 16 to 20, and their caregivers, so parents usually.
And you mentioned the geography earlier.
Yeah.
Heavily North American.
Very much so. 17 studies from the U.S., 4 from Canada, just 1 from Ireland. That's definitely a limitation we need to remember.
And the programs themselves, what do they look like?
A real mix, actually. Some were online, digital things, apps maybe. Others were face-to-face, like workshops or lectures. Some combined approaches. And it's interesting, the source notes that quite a few of them, 10 actually, use materials from existing campaigns, like the CDC's Heads Up program here in the States, or FIFA's Concussion Toolkit.
So building on stuff that's already out there.
Often, yeah. And the meta-analysis part, that's where they pooled the data statistically. They looked at studies measuring similar things, changes in knowledge about concussions, shifts in attitudes towards them, and, crucially, changes in actual reporting behavior, trying to find that average effect.
Okay, so let's get to the results. When they crunched all those numbers from those 22 studies, what did they find? Did these programs actually, move the needle? And where?
Right. This is the core of it. They found that, yes, the interventions did work, but differently for different things. They were most effective at increasing knowledge or awareness.
So teaching the facts work best.
Pretty much. If the goal was just making sure people knew what a concussion is, what the symptoms are, the programs generally did a good job. The effect was statistically significant, clearly positive.
Okay, that seems logical. But what about attitudes? Like how seriously people took the risks?
They looked at that too, and the interventions did have a positive effect on attitudes as well, also significant. But the effect was smaller, noticeably smaller than for knowledge.
How much smaller?
Based on their stats, the average effect on attitudes was almost half the size of the effect on knowledge.
Huh. So it's way easier to teach someone a fact than it is to change how they actually feel about it or how important they think it is.
That's what the data suggests. And then the third piece, reporting behavior. Did athletes actually report symptoms more often after these programs?
The million-dollar question, really.
Absolutely, given the underreporting problem. And here again, they found a significant positive effect. The programs did seem to encourage more reporting.
Okay, that's good news. How did that compare to knowledge and attitudes?
The effect on behavior was stronger than the effect on attitudes, but actually a bit weaker than the effect on pure knowledge.
Interesting. So knowledge is easiest to shift than getting people to actually report, and attitudes are the toughest nut to crack.
Roughly, yeah. That seems to be the pattern emerging from this collection of studies.
And this really highlights that gap, doesn't it, between knowing something and doing something about it. You mentioned health behavior theories.
Right, like the theory of planned behavior.
Yeah.
It suggests knowledge is fundamental, sure, but you also need the right attitudes, and you need to feel like you can perform the behavior and that people around you support it. All that feeds into actual action.
And the review itself points out that even with knowledge, even with maybe positive attitudes, that sports culture.
That culture can just override it all. Peer pressure, not wanting to miss games, that internal drive. It shows that just giving out leaflets or showing a video, while important, probably isn't enough by itself to tackle those really deep-seated social and psychological factors.
Okay, let's talk about how these programs were run. Did it matter how long they lasted?
That seemed to be a key point the review picked up on. Most of the interventions they looked at were actually quite short, like typically only running for 1 or 2 months.
Just a brief intervention then.
Yeah, relatively brief. And the source points out that while you might see some immediate positive effects from these short programs, those effects might well fade over time. They use the phrase habit slips.
Ah, so people might learn something, maybe even intend to act differently, but then things just drift back to how they were before.
It makes intuitive sense, doesn't it? Changing habits, changing attitudes, especially ones tied up in strong social norms like in sports, it takes time. It takes reinforcement, like consolidating a memory almost.
So a one-off workshop probably isn't going to cut it long term.
Likely not. The review suggests that future efforts really need to think about longer durations, maybe incorporating booster sessions later on, or periodic refreshers. Or even better, finding ways to integrate this education and reinforcement right into the routine activities of a sports team throughout the whole season.
Make it part of the fabric, not just a special event.
Exactly.
What about other things? Did, say, the specific sport seem to matter? Or how the information was delivered, video versus lecture versus an app? Or the age of the kids?
This was one of the more surprising findings, actually. When they looked at the overall effectiveness, none of those factors seemed to make a consistent, significant difference.
Really? That is surprising. You'd think maybe a game-based app would work better for younger kids, or that football culture might need a different approach than soccer.
You'd think so, right. But the combined data, the meta-analysis, didn't really bear that out strongly across the board. The effects were sort of similar, regardless of the sport, the delivery method, or even the age or gender of the athletes.
Wow. Okay. But was there anything that stood out, any group or factor where it did make a difference?
Yes, there was one really clear exception. The interventions seemed to be consistently more effective when they targeted caregivers, parents, guardians.
Focusing on the parents.
Exactly. Especially for influencing attitudes and encouraging the athletes themselves to report symptoms. The impact seems stronger when caregivers were actively involved in the intervention.
Why would that be? What's the thinking there?
The review suggests it's likely because caregivers, especially for younger adolescents, were often the main drivers behind health decisions. They're the ones who reinforce messages at home, who might notice subtle changes, who ultimately decide whether to seek medical advice or keep a kid out of play.
Right, they have that ongoing influence and decision-making power.
Precisely. Their involvement seems to provide a kind of sustained reinforcement that's maybe harder to achieve just by targeting the athlete alone within the sports setting.
That makes a lot of sense. So, Why didn't the other factors, like sport or delivery method, show much difference? Any theories on that?
Well, the review authors offered a potential reason. They suggested that many of the interventions included in their analysis might not have been explicitly built on a strong theoretical foundation of how health behavior change actually works.
Meaning they weren't designed with a clear psychological or communication theory in mind?
Perhaps not explicitly enough. So, if the underlying principles driving the intervention design aren't clear, it becomes hard to see why certain features, like using a video versus a discussion, might be more or less effective for specific outcomes or groups. It muddies the water a bit when trying to isolate what really works.
Okay, so we have these key findings. Knowledge is the easiest win. Attitudes and behavior are tougher. Caregivers are really key. Duration probably matters. But there are always limitations with this kind of research, right? What did the review authors say about the studies they included?
Oh, definitely. They were very upfront about the limitations. The big one we already mentioned is geography. Almost all studies were from the US or Canada. This weird populations issue, Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic, means we have to be careful about saying these results apply everywhere.
What works in North America might land differently elsewhere.
Exactly. Cultural context could be huge. They also pointed out that quite a few of the individual studies had pretty small sample sizes.
Which makes it harder to be confident in the results.
Right. It's harder to detect real effects, or you might get results skewed by chance. And we talked about the short duration of most interventions. That means the review couldn't really say much definitive about long-term impact. If effects fade after 6 months, a 2-month study won't catch it.
Makes sense. Any other major caveats?
Yeah, another significant one was the inconsistency in how things were measured. Different studies use different questionnaires or methods to assess knowledge or attitudes or reporting behavior.
Like using different rulers to measure the same thing?
That's a great analogy. It makes it really difficult to accurately combine the data in a meta-analysis and be sure you're comparing apples to apples.
Okay.
And finally, they noted that the overall quality and the level of detail reported in the included studies varied quite a bit. Some studies were better designed and reported than others. Few met the absolute highest standards for research quality, and sometimes crucial details about exactly how the intervention was delivered were missing.
So important findings, but we need to see them through the lens of the underlying research quality and scope.
Absolutely. It provides that crucial context for interpretation.
So pulling all of that together, the findings, the gaps, the limitations, what did the authors recommend for the future? Where do we go from here?
They laid out some pretty clear recommendations. Firstly, just more rigorous research is needed. We need studies with really robust designs, like properly conducted randomized controlled trials.
The gold standard.
Ideally, yes, and with larger groups of participants and critically follow-up periods that are much longer, so we can actually see if these changes stick around.
Tackling those limitations directly.
Exactly. They also really emphasize the need for standardized measurement tools. If researchers could agree on using consistent, validated ways to measure knowledge, attitudes, reporting behavior, maybe using something like the Rocco survey they mentioned, it would make future studies much more comparable.
Getting everyone using the same ruler, basically.
Basically, yeah. Building a stronger, more coherent evidence base. And of course, they strongly recommended expanding the research geographically. We really need studies outside North America to understand if these patterns hold true in different cultural contexts and sports systems.
See if it's a universal challenge or more context-specific.
Right. And finally, a big push for collaboration. They suggested bringing together public health experts, health communication specialists, and the sports communities, coaches, leagues, athletes, parents.
Working together.
Working together to design better interventions. Interventions that aren't just about information, but are grounded in solid theories of behavior change that specifically target those tricky psychological and social barriers, and that are maybe integrated more naturally into the everyday life of youth sports.
So, moving beyond just information pamphlets to creating programs that really aim to shift the culture and the actual actions people take.
That's the goal, equipping and supporting everyone involved to make safer choices, even when the pressure's on.
Okay, so wrapping up our deep dive here. This really comprehensive review confirms something we maybe suspected, that while education programs can definitely boost knowledge about concussions in young athletes, actually changing their attitudes and, more importantly, getting them to consistently report potential symptoms, that's much, much harder.
It really is a different challenge.
And caregivers, parents, they seem to be a particularly vital group to engage in these efforts. Plus, it looks like real, lasting change isn't likely to come from short, one-off programs. We probably need approaches that are longer term, more integrated into the sports environment itself.
Yeah, it points towards needing to shift the whole environment, the culture, not just deliver isolated facts.
Which really leaves us with a significant thought to ponder, doesn't it? We have the science, we understand the risk, and we know education can increase awareness, but there's still this persistent, dangerous gap between knowing the right thing to do and actually doing it, especially in that high-stakes, high-pressure world of youth sports where fitting in, performing, not letting people down, those are powerful motivators.
Hugely powerful.
So how do we bridge that gap for these young athletes? What's the role for everyone involved? Parents, coaches, teammates, the leagues themselves, in building a culture where admitting you might be hurt, where reporting a potential concussion is seen not as a weakness, but actually as a sign of strength and responsibility. It feels like it goes way beyond just sharing information. It's about fundamentally shifting the culture, something for all of us to think about next time we're watching a game.